Professor James Heckman and Professor Steven Durlauf, thank you very much for joining us here at the Fung Global Institute. Let's start by talking about your research project in China. Could you tell me a bit more about that?
Well, this project is something that we just started, and it should be treated with some caution because the details remain to be worked out. But I would say that the Chinese government and the China Development Research Foundation has given a lot of thought, careful thought, to what effective policies would be for promoting child development in rural areas of China. And one of the big issues is nutrition and anemia even. It's pretty well documented that children who are suffering iron deficiencies will grow up with permanent deficiencies in IQ and other impairments in terms of both personality traits and in terms of cognitive traits. And that there are conditions in parts of China which are suggesting children are sufficiently undernourished. And so there are questions of both macronutrients and micronutrients, specific nutrients like iron, zinc, and so forth, where there could actually be major improvements. Now, here's where I come, I think, to the wisdom of the China Development Research Foundation, namely that understanding the interventions. I was involved in a study, which we just finished actually, looking at a program in Jamaica, had nothing to do with China directly, but it was on provision of nutrients to stunted children in Jamaican slums in Kingston, Jamaica. And various interventions were tried. One was a nutrient intervention, just changing the calories. A second was a psychosocial intervention, and the third was a combination of the two. And the studies that were done showed that the lasting effects came from the psychosocial interventions, the ones that actually did more than nutrition. And that to the best of my knowledge, the original stimulation, the original motivation, which was just nutrients only, has been now amended to a more comprehensive notion of how stimulation might be done for the rural children. But there's a real problem about the left behind children in rural China. And I mean, there's a very serious issue for China's future, for both the economic inequality as well as for social productivity in the next generation. So there's, 58 million children are alleged to be left behind under the age of 18. And quite a few of those children are not receiving stimulation. They're being raised by their grandparents, who are typically less educated than their parents would be. And the conditions, the forecast conditions for those children is desperate, really. I think it's really a serious social issue. So I think it's very great that the Chinese government's addressing the question and that this is now viewed as an economic development strategy as well as a social policy strategy. And that's where these two things come together and where the INET connection has actually been very productive in thinking about these policies that are efficient for redistribution, that actually change productivity, promote productivity, and reduce inequality. I think that's the theme of our work.
INET is funding this new research project in China as part of its new framework economic thinking. Why is this research so cutting edge? And how does this fit into the way Asia's thinking about its long-term development?
Well, I would say that what makes the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Group, I don't want to say unique, but representing new economic thinking, is that it's about social science. And by that I mean that the barriers between economics and psychology, neuroscience, genetics, sociology, even political science are explicitly of no interest to us, because we're trying to understand extraordinarily complicated phenomena, and our objective is to understand the phenomena in their totality, and as a result, the traditional disciplinary barriers would be better barriers in the impediment sense, and so that is why INET is facilitating, because this type of research doesn't fit into the conventional boxes, as it were, of academia.
And in particular, this notion that is very prevalent in economics about redistribution as being a question of just sort of giving, I wouldn't say just in economics. I think the new Pope now has gotten pretty committed to this idea and has been for his whole life, which is saying, alms to the poor, helping the underprivileged, And it's an enlightened, and the motives are of the highest quality, but at the same time, they may be somewhat short-sighted in the sense if you think about a long-term strategy. It may not be giving alms, it may be giving skills to poor kids. It may be better, more effective strategy than sort of giving money to poor adults and making it a zero-sum game where you're taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor.
And I think one of the messages of Jim's work in particular is this conventional wisdom almost that there's an equity efficiency trade-off is fallacious. In other words, there's very complicated processes that simultaneously determine levels of economic growth and determine aspects of inequality and deprivation. And within that, there exist strategies that can actually improve on both dimensions.
Yeah. See, Steve is right to emphasize the interdisciplinary nature of the work and the fact that it's built around the structure of multiple periods in the life of the child and the life of the adult, and really understanding that the initial conditions get set. They are harder and harder to change as it gets older. That's an intuitive idea. I don't think it originated in the 20th century. It probably originated in Central Africa when Lucy was was nursing her first kid. I mean, a lot of this is just organized common sense, which gets lost. But I do think that what's happened is that in some sense, academics are harmful. And I'll tell you why. Because when you formalize knowledge, there's an old joke about the PhD is knowing more and more about less and less. Part of it is that people get very focused on particular notions. So we get a clarity. And that's fine for understanding knowledge. But for understanding policy, you need a kind of fuzziness maybe a little bit, or you need to at least draw more widely. And in this case, I think the focus that you see so much attention on PISA scores, we heard that mentioned today, looking only at one dimension of human development, even treating, as MacArthur was doing earlier today, separating health from the rest of economic development strategy, personal development strategy. That just represents a silo, kind of, I hate to use that word, but some kind of very, very narrow thinking, which really flies in the face of what we know. I mean, a good health strategy is a strategy that promotes human development early on, and self-control, cognition, education, that's part of it. But they interact with each other in ways that people, we've been educated to think, well, no, we're specialists in cognition. Our job is to raise PISA scores. Our job is to reduce health. And we never say, oh, maybe if we improve education, we're going to promote health. Maybe if we improve early life conditions, we'll improve. So it's that thinking. And we keep learning more and more about the human development process.
So let's talk long-term now. Some of these problems in early childhood affect the long-term development of a child, of an adult. It can last for decades to come, the negative effects. Could you tell me a bit more about that?
Well, it's holistic, but on the other hand, look, 100 years ago, everybody was completely convinced that genetics determined everything. I'm worried about going to the opposite extreme. Now we're going to say, oh, environment determines everything, and we know that's not true either. There is a genetic basis. Now, the way the genes express themselves can be modified by experience. We don't really know quantitatively yet how important that is. We know that it's demonstrated in certain cases, isolated. So there is a genetic component. I mean, people don't like to talk about that either, and they don't even interpret it correctly. Steve has worked on this. So I think we really want to try to keep understand. I think the issue is, at least for I don't want to speak for Steve, but I would say that I feel strongly that the public policies kind of get easily oversimplified. People really want to know it's this. It's all experience. It's all genes. It's all something or other. It's more subtle. And I think as we acquire more knowledge, we can develop better policies. But I think that economists don't have any monopoly. I mean, there's one view of economics, right? The imperial view that price theory models developed in the 1930s should explain everything in human behavior. And I think they're useful for organizing tools. But frankly, when you look at the predictive power of many of these models, they in terms of R squared, so the fraction of variance explained, I remember participating in when I started out my academic career, I was very interested in these models. I still am. But I remember if we went from earnings equations to fertility equations to marriage equations, the R squares kept deteriorating from 0.1 to 0.01 to 0.001. You get, well, wait, that's okay. It explains part of the story, but something else is missing. And I think we're looking at some of those other things. And it's not to say that economics is wrong or anything of the sort. It's basically saying it can be supplemented. And in the end, I think the economics that emerges will be richer. That's the part. So it's not like saying this guy's wrong or that guy's wrong. It's saying they're all got some ideas. But what they need more than anything else is data. And we need some facts and put them on the table. So, okay.
Professor Stephen Durlauf, what is driving you to make this project such a success? Why have you taken it on?
To be honest, it's passionate concern about inequality and deprivation.
And why China?
Well, the initiative, I mean, the overall working group is about the globe, as arrogant as that may sound. In terms of China, there's a number of dimensions. One of them is the facts on the ground are that both cross-sectional life course inequality and have increased as well, and it appears, though this is obviously less clear, that intergenerational mobility has decreased. And so these are the questions naturally come to the fore. That's issue number one. Issue number two, if you're talking about 20% of the human race, an improvement in the lives of children here is almost definitionally of first order importance. The third, and this is a selfish academic point, is that the opportunities to expand the domain of social science knowledge are vast here. I mean, not just because there are more people, but because of the differences in civilization and political institutions and the like. All of these create opportunities for social scientists to create contrast with the rest of the world and thereby advance knowledge quite generally.
And how does this fit into the way Asia's thinking about its long-term development?
Well, I guess the question is, there's a commonality of humans. There's not a commonality of cultures, but there's a commonality of humans. And so developmental processes, I would argue, biological parts of it, are pretty universal. What's interesting is to look across cultures and see how cultures and other aspects of the environment, legal, economic features, affect that developmental process. You have a basic biology, a basic equality, a fundamental equality of human beings. And then you ask, well, how is it then with this fundamental equality, how is it we end up so different? I mean, fundamental equality, not to say that everybody's born with the same brain power, that everybody has the same talents, but certainly populations, I think, are pretty much the same. And you ask, how come outcomes are so different across these different countries and different cultures? That to me is fascinating. And of course, I agree with Steve that it's a way of really gaining understanding. I'll give you an example. We should tell them about the identity and personality group that we have, and you've been very effective putting together. And that one aspect of it, the narrow aspect, is there's something called the Big Five in personality psychology. That's sometimes called the longitude and latitude. It's a Western concept. It's been developed primarily from studies in initially the US and then some in Western Europe. The question is, how does this map into what would be values in Confucian cultures, for example, or other cultures? And we have a paper, actually written by a colleague who's going to be at the conference in Beijing next June, looking at the standard parameters in behavior in the characterizations of personality in Chinese societies and in Western societies. And they're different, and the values are different. And the question is, how important is this? How important is the emphasis on the Confucian ethic? How important early in life? And how much does this affect then the later choices that children make? People were talking about creativity. They were talking about aspects of obedience and so forth that might be mentioned in one part. So I know the Japanese, they have this whole institute. They're trying to talk about creativity. There's a stereotype that Asians aren't creative. I don't know if that's really true. I think there's an exam-taking notion in China, but there's certainly plenty of creative Chinese, and I've met them personally and learned from them.
So 8,000 years of civilization.
Exactly. but there is a sense that there are some values that are different, that are emphasized. And the question is, how important are they? And then, how will they change? So will the Confucian ethic break down as societies industrialize? Or will it be a source of strength? And what exactly is the Confucian family ethic in the sense of how it translates into human development? Just the Confucian ethic in the sense of internal control and internal equilibrium. And so there's a lot to learn there. Just changing countries, but keeping on the same continent. To me, it's fascinating why it is that the fertility rate has fallen so much in a country like Bangladesh, whereas it hasn't fallen so much in Pakistan. So you have two Islamic countries. They both have kind of common religion, so you can't look to the prophet to make a distinction. And you can also look then to the opportunities of women, certain cultural values. There's a Bengali value actually in Bangladesh and so forth. But we don't know. We really don't know. There's a lot of variation even in provinces within India. So again, how much of that is cultural? And Amartya Sen has stressed a lot, some cultural importance. But we haven't looked at that as how it affects the human development process, this early development process. How important is it to grow up in a family structure or not a culture that emphasizes certain things over others? And does it arrest development? Does it promote development? What are the features?